because that's what the Bible promises. That's what God tells me. So the last point, and then we'll go to questions, which I thought was an interesting one. In the light of these fires, how do we think about the arsonists? It seems that there are at least some of these fires that were lit deliberately. So one of the interesting points has been, well, how do we respond to arsonists, to people who are culpable, who contributed to this evil? And I'm fascinated. I don't know, did you see some of those guys being interviewed? Two responses that struck me. One was, let's lynch them. Basically, let's find the arsonists and let's shoot them. You saw some interviews? That's understandable, isn't it? I mean, what's the response to evil? Eradicate it. Now, there's another response. The politically correct response was, well, they're really sick. I mean, they're sick puppies. They're mentally ill. They're deranged. We need to treat them. So they're either really, really bad, let's kill them, or they're really, really mad, so let's treat them. How do you think God would treat an arsonist? How do you think God would treat the arsonists? This is how I think it would go. I think God would look at the arsonist and say something like this, and say, you know, my dear child, you know those fires you lit? Well, those fires are just a metaphor, just an example that ultimately I created. I put fire on this world so that you could understand something of my nature and what I'm going to do in the world. Because, my dear child arsonist, the fires that you lit are only a foretaste of what is to come. Because I am a consuming fire, God would say. I told you that in Hebrews 12. Our God is a consuming fire. And God would say to the arsonist, you know, there will be a day when my judgment, my wrath and my anger on all evil, on all injustice, on everything that destroys human life, my wrath and anger and judgment is going to fall on this world in a way that is like a consuming fire that you've just lit, but is far more thorough, far more terrifying, far more complete and eternal in its eradication of evil. And I am a consuming fire. My judgment is going to come. It is going to burn up and consume and eradicate and end all evil and injustice. And my dear brother, my dear child arsonist, that consuming fire is coming for you. And I think the arsonist would go, oh dear, I'm stuffed. And then God would say, but that's not the end of the story. Because my dear child who I've made and who I love, even though you're warped and twisted and evil, I know that you can't survive the fire of my judgment that's coming. So here's what I've done. I've done a metaphysical backburning operation. And I've backburned some space where you can find safety from my coming judgment. And at this point, the arsonist would be looking and going, oh, really? He gets the whole backburning thing. You know what the metaphysical backburning is that God would be talking about? This is what he'd say. He'd say, you know what? When I came to earth in the person of my son, Jesus Christ, all that consuming fire of my judgment that will one day come, that has now fallen on my son, Jesus Christ, in his death on the cross. The wrath of God, the fire of God's judgment and eradication of evil fell on Jesus and consumed Jesus. Why? So that now you and I and the arsonist, instead of standing in our own paddocks looking at the oncoming wrath and judgment of God against all our evil, and while you are not an arsonist and I'm not an arsonist, let's not kid ourselves. We are different from an arsonist only in matter of degree, not in matter of kind. We are wicked, twisted, self-centered, complicit by what we do and by what we don't do. And that is coming. God's judgment is going to come and consume us. But now God says, I've created a space. My judgment has fallen, has burnt up the evil and sin of the world in Jesus. If you stand on the spot where Jesus stood, if you trust Jesus, my judgment will not touch you, because fire cannot burn what has already been burnt. So being a Christian is not about being moral or judgmental or religious or good or better than anyone else. Being a Christian is about going, there is a good God. He's loved me. I've rebelled against him. His judgment is coming like a consuming fire. I've seen what fire can do. And now what God has done is he's created a safe space for me. So I am going to follow Jesus. I'm going to hang on to Jesus. And in hanging on to Jesus, I will be safe and spared from God's wrath to come. God would look at the arsonist and say, my child, you have an opportunity to be spared if you turn and follow Jesus and stand on the burnt ground of the cross of Jesus. And God would say that to you, and he would say that to me, and he would say that to every man, woman, and child in Melbourne and in Victoria, that these fires, as tragic as they are really, in one level, a metaphor for what is to come. I'm not saying God is literally a bushfire. I want to take it too far. It's a metaphor. But it gives us an opportunity to see graphically how to be spared, how to be saved in the face of coming fire. And that's what God says to us. I've done that for you by pouring out the fire of my wrath on my Son, so that you might be spared.